So do you feel that the big issue has been successful? How do you measure it? It's sort of unquantifiable in a way. It hasn't solved homelessness, but how do you measure it really?
The big issue never set out to solve homelessness. The big issue set out to decriminalise people in need and to put them in a different situation. It also set out to kind of convert as many people who had it within them to move on to some other places. So most of our vendors over the years have moved on to other things, sometimes worse, sometimes to death, sometimes to prison, sometimes to the hospital, and sometimes to a good increase in their social opportunities.
And it's helped humanise people who may otherwise be ignored or voiceless because you have an interaction. Yeah.
What we've done is we've given homeless people the chance of reconnecting with society in general. And if somebody said, are we successful? I say we're successful in parts, and other parts, we haven't managed to do. We haven't managed to get the demons out of people's heads that brought them to homelessness.
No, but there's governmental forces and other forces at work that you can't control.
Yeah, that's one of the things. The other thing is you need a shed load of money.
Yeah.
If you want to put somebody through a detox and a rehab and then put them in a therapeutic community. And unless you can do that, you often find that you can get people kind of straight, but they're still going to have problems. I mean, we've put too many people into flats, and you go and visit them, a year or two later, and they're still living out of black bin liners. So they're outdoor homeless become indoor homeless. Yeah. So there are all those sorts of problems. What we really do need to do is we need to get sensible about homelessness. Yeah. And in my opinion, we should look upon rough sleeping in particular as a human rights abuse, and as the fact that if you do sleep rough, you will become mentally ill in a very, very short space of time if you're not ill already. So the important thing is to move people off the streets. And that means don't let them sleep on the streets. Don't encourage them to sleep on the streets.
There is the argument people, once they are on the streets for a prolonged period of time, actually don't want to move into four walls because it's claustrophobic. So you're saying that we need to get early intervention would prevent that?
I wouldn't let people sleep on the streets.
Really? So do you think that what happened during the pandemic was something that we could have done a long time ago and should continue? I mean, we showed we could do it then with a will, or was that not actually appropriate, just forcing people into flats that were still isolated?
What they did with Everyone In campaign from March, which we were involved in, and we were advantaged because...
And that was putting everyone who was rough sleeping into some form of accommodation,
The good thing about it is we did take people out, and you could socially isolate them, because the important thing was not to have them spreading COVID, and feed them and all that. The bad thing about it was there was very little social support. There was very little, medical support. There was very little, mental health support. Yeah, I mean, and it was done in a kind of rush, it was like putting up a refugee camp. And you just had to get people in a place where they could be isolated, where they could sleep and be fed. And a lot of people didn't do very well with that. A number of people, surprisingly, the figures, I don't have the figures, but the figures of people who didn't return to the streets is very encouraging. So,
is that because they were allowed to stay on, or because something in their lifestyle changed which enabled them to move on and develop?
Well, it meant that when they got out, they could get housing, could get accommodation, could get rooms, and they flourished. So it was a break.
Yeah,
the unfortunate thing is that what we need to do is we need to make almost a kind of major investment, because homeless people can cost society an enormous amount of money. I mean, it can be anything from £15,000 a year to £100,000 a year. And the thing is, as we know, that...
Why do they cost so much money?
Well, because the the support systems that are there, the charities that are supported by government money, the charities
So what
that are
you mean,
supported,
drug and alcohol,
or hostels or temporary accommodation. Also, the policing issue,
Yeah.
the issue of that if you get a lot of homeless people in a particular area, people don't want to go there, so there's a hit on shops in the community, and if they're taking drugs, then that has a knock-on effect on the quality of life in that area. I know people who live right in the middle of all that, and it's not a good place to live. Now you can't put a price on that, but it is something that has to be taken into account.
But
the other thing is that I don't know if you know, but according to a survey that I saw from Canada, that the biggest bit of money that is spent on the average person in the course of their lives by the health service is in the last 3 months of their life.
Yeah.
And that, with homeless people, that 3 months can be 6 months, can be 9 months.
Yeah.
So you could actually have that kind of situation.
Yeah.
The other thing is the amount of mental illness that leads people to try to take their own lives and end up in the A&E ended up in the intensive care unit. I had a guy who I worked with up in the north, and he tried to commit suicide on quite a number of occasions, and he was always being brought back. But the thing was, I mean, every time it was a kind of £50,000 hit.
Yeah.
So there's all these kind of hidden costs.
But from as a legacy of, so we had a response to we had the lockdown, a response to COVID, which was locking down. And now as we come out, I know you've campaigned on this, we have an end to furlough. We also have an increase in energy prices. So it's not, obviously street homelessness is one thing, but we also have people in very vulnerable temporary accommodation. And I know you've got a campaign going now to highlight the number of people who are in a precarious situation right now who may become homeless. Is it something like 500,000, I think?
There's about 500,000 people who are behind on their rent and or mortgage.
And why are they given?
Largely because they've lost their livelihood
Right.
because of COVID. Dominic Raab did say in the summer of 2020 that nobody would become homeless because of COVID. There's already hundreds of people who've been evicted or under eviction orders, 6 months eviction order, and they will become homeless and their children will become homeless. I am very, very worried because, we work with about 17,000 homeless people a year. What would happen if there was another 50,000 added, or another 100,000, or another 200,000? This is that will have an enormous effect on the costs are astronomical to the exchequer, to the health service, to the school system. You imagine your children, one day they're in a place where mum and dad have built them a kind of safety zone, and the next they're in a temporary accommodation provided by the local authority. What is that going to do to mum and dad's well-being, their health, their mental health? Yeah. What about the children? The children would be going into school. I mean, I don't know if you know, but children who are put in bed and breakfast, for instance, they feel socially ostracized, and it means that they don't function very well at school, and they get picked on and all sorts of stuff.
Can often be sharing beds, no internet connection, and
it's a bit like in the old Victorian times. You'd have children going into school from the workhouse, and they would be called workhouse. It'd be Workhouse Johnny or Workhouse Mary and all that stuff. And all of that stuff, I mean, it frightens the life out of me because on the occasions I've been homeless, it's really affected my mental well-being.
And we have a perfect storm, don't we, at the moment? We have rising energy prices. Inflation, we hear today, has risen for the first time in 10 years quite significantly. We have universal credit. The £20 uplift has been removed.
That's interesting because what they did was, under Cameron's regime, they took the £20 off. They took that top off. That's not a top up. Right. That is a return to what was taken 5 years ago. it was taken out of the universal credit. And even people like Ian Duncan Smith, who inaugurated all of that stuff, has said it's not a top-up. It's a returning to what had existed in the early days of universal credit. So, these kind of things are, as you call it, a perfect storm. They're coming together.
So what's your fear and how do we fix it?
Well, my fear is that the government will not bite the bullet. Treasuries are really, really good, if they are good at anything, is to spend money on emergencies. They're very good at, building prisons, or in some ways they're quite good at building hospitals. They're not very good at building prevention. So they're not very good. They can put the money aside for an airport or a railway line for capital expenditure. They're not very good at doing that for education. They're not very good at doing that for health prevention. They're not very good at that for preventing crime. So if you say to them, look, if you leave these people to slip into homelessness, the readers of the big issue as opposed to the vendors, or the readers of the Spectator or whatever, or the Mirror or the Sun, if you allow them to slip in, you imagine the enormous impact that is going to have on the school system and on the social system and on the health service. It's enormous.
Yeah.
And so governments, when you present them with that facts, they want to whittle it down and say, well, we've got this situation now. We've got more vacancies than we've ever had. And at the same time, we've got these people who said, all right, then, well, let's create the mechanism. That's all you need to do. Create the mechanism that, first of all, keeps somebody in their home. So you pay their rent and their mortgage, and you
would that
support
not be
them.
socially unacceptable because people would take advantage of it, do you think?
Well, people have always taken advantage. If you make somebody an MP, you know darn well that some of them are going to take advantage of it, and they're going to milk it for every penny they get. Does that mean we should stop having MPs? I think
So we pay their mortgages to prevent them
or their rent. We keep them in the home
because it costs a lot more. Private accommodation is much more expensive often.
2 or 3 times the rent. So 2 or 3 times the cost of allowing an individual or a family, of the 500,000 people who are behind in rent, about 230,000 of those, almost half of them, have dependents, have children.
Yes.
So you imagine what that's going to do. So that's 500,000 families or individuals. That's not. That is almost probably, that could be 1 million people already. So you imagine what would happen if they joined the ranks of the dispossessed. That would have an enormous effect on
we haven't got enough temporary accommodation, I don't think. I mean, I did go round.
No, you don't need. We don't.
Right.
We're not asking. We're not saying to the government provide temporary accommodation.
No, but I'm saying if they use it, if they crisis manage the situation like they normally do, they will then, those people will become homeless. Then they will need to be rehoused in boxes or warehouses. I've been around some of them, shocking places, and they cost a fortune or they cost a lot more. But there aren't enough even of those in the system to house those 500,000 or
that's right.
230,000.
I misunderstood you.
No, I'm saying that this does seem to be. So have you put that to government? Have you said we need to?
I've put that to government. I've put it to government on maybe 8. I've done it. I was at the Conservative Party conference. I was talking to the policy unit at Number 10. I've had meetings with ministers. I've had meetings with MPs. And if you talk to ordinary MPs, ordinary Conservative MPs or Labour MPs, they will all agree with you that something has to be done. Keep people in their homes, pay their mortgage, pay their rent, pay their back rent and back mortgage, which is about 650 million, and get them into work. So what we've got to do is, like shit off a shovel, we have to get people out of the emergency into the recovery. And we are not very good at that. We are still living in a semi-recovery, a semi-emergency situation.
Yeah.
The government seems to be talking as though we're in a recovery. We've got, we've never had as many vacancies, But the vacancies, in order for somebody who has lost their job to get another job, we need to join that up so that they are not dependent on the
state.
exchequer, on the taxpayer for longer than is necessary.
And so people have agreed with you that this is a crisis about, or potentially about to happen. And has anyone said, well, how do we fix it? And what is your map for doing that?
I keep saying the same simple thing. You keep people in their homes. Don't let them.
Yeah.
What a number of charities have done and a number of activists have done, and I think they're stupid for doing it, is they've said, what we've got to do is give the money to the local authorities so they can get the temporary accommodation so that people don't become homeless. And I'm saying that's crazy. You've got to prevent people from falling into homelessness, to falling into need. That's where the damage is done.
Yeah.
And we've got to get rid of the damage that hangs over like a Damoclesian sword over the lives of those people who are under threat because they're going to be evicted or they're going to go to court to face eviction.
Yeah. So we still seem to be, we say we're in recovery and we're learning to live with COVID, but actually still we're talking about daily numbers. We're spent, I think, 100 billion on testing. In fact, maybe there's a different prioritization of some of the resources because actually being homeless and, it's deadly, isn't it? Ultimately, the people are more at risk. Mental ill health and material wealth are also deadly, as well as
if you
a virus.
consider that 70% of all the effort that goes into running Parliament and all the questions and all the laws, 70% of that time is spent on the collateral and the direct damage created by poverty. And you add another 10% of that because of these people, then you're talking about completely distorting the future of the United Kingdom. Or, whatever it's called.
So when you look down the track of next 10 years, 5 years, what do you see?
I don't carry out those kind of. I'm not that sagacious, but what I just want to avoid certain things. I want to avoid mass homelessness, and I also want the government, which is the other thing that I'm doing, is to embrace the idea of a future generations bill, where we take what the Welsh have been doing for the last 6 years, take what they're doing, which is to try and make all of the plans that governments go through and local authorities, and make all of that all to do with spending, budgetary spending on prevention, budgetary spending on what is needed, budgetary spending on schools, and on social improvement, on social housing and all those things. So that actually what you do is you dismantle poverty over a period of time rather than allow it to kind of become almost a part of the superstructure of society and government.
To get locked in. And do you think the response to the coronavirus has made this more of a threat?
I think we're in a really weird way, real world. I'm one of those kind of persons who's very forgiving. I don't think the government did a bad job, and I don't think it did a particularly good job. I think it did the job of people who were panicked. I believe that there was a loss of nerve, occasionally, continuously, at times. I think what always happens is that people jump onto something like the COVID thing, as they did in the Second World War, and they look if they can make money out of it. So there's a lot of people who've walked away. I mean, isn't it interesting that all of the big, the oligarchs have made more money in the last year? It's so interesting. They've made money out of crisis. They've made money out of death. They've made money out of mental illness. They've made money out of a reversal for the lives of many, many people. And I think what we will need to do is we're going to have to get away from that cavalier capitalism. It's the worst thing, because in the end it will destroy capitalism itself. And as Lenin says, not John Lennon, but the other Lenin, he said, the thing about a capitalist, they will sell you the rope by which you hang them. And that is what they're doing. They are preparing their own mortification.
But we're moving towards an infrastructure, looking at the whole political system, where we are under much more control. And I know we've talked a little bit about these vaccine passports, and people will have to, these are things that, a lot of things that we've done are not evidence-based. There's no good evidence for them. They may harm our economy as well, but it seems like this is another money-making opportunity. As you say, we're sort of riding a coach and horses through our democracy. And is that a worry to you? Do you see the way we're heading as a concern for people that have already no voice? Or
my problem is I don't believe this is a conspiracy. I'm sure there are many conspiracies, but what I find most difficult is for people to think when you do something for the first time, you tend to make a pig's ear of it. When we started the big issue, I was telling an audience last night, if you went back 30 years ago to November 1991, you had a load of headless chickens running around.
I was one of them. I don't know whether...
running around, doing things, harming our work, helping our work and all that. And I think what happened with the corona thing is that what we should have done, if I was in government, I would have said, look, we're in a totally new zone and we're going to have to try a number of things, and we're going to have to do things in a totally new way. We're going to have to wear masks. We're going to have to separate. We're going to have to put stuff on our hands. We're going to have to bump up the amount of beds that are available for people in COVID. This will affect other people requiring health things, and they should have done it in a much, much more planned thing. And what's so interesting that Britain, the UK, which is the most highly centralised country in the whole of Europe, and in one of the most highly centralised countries in the whole of the world, in some ways they're a bit like Russia, but in other ways we are a loose-fitting, centralised economy. And why that centralised economy couldn't be converted into a supply economy that could actually make things move a lot quicker it beggars belief. And I think a lot of it is because of what happened with Brexit. I think Brexit created a new kind of politics, a new kind of politicians, a new the Conservative Party was changed overnight into a new kind of party, almost a kind of ideologically free falling and jumping. And Boris is a kind of person who could go in any direction. You wouldn't know whether he's left, right, centre, or whatever. And I think that probably wasn't the kind of leadership you wanted at that time. Maybe other times you would want it. But what you needed was very stern, very difficult, saying we are in difficult times. We don't know what we're doing. But because we don't know what we're doing, and we admit that we're not knowing what we're doing, we are in a very strong position to find out what to do.
But that was in the early... I mean, I don't want to go too much about that, but that was right in the early days. And we've seen across the world that, lockdowns don't... the places that did lock down, didn't lock down, Sweden, there's not real difference in mortality. It's very unclear. It's unclear. So what I suppose we're 18 months, perhaps 19 months on, 2 years in, we're still... in some kind of... We've still got emergency powers out, affecting people's lives, restricting them, when we are also said that we've got to learn to live with it. And perhaps, what this podcast could highlight is that then there's another focus. There are other focuses. There is a collateral damage from our response to COVID, and there are other things that we need to focus on, which are also emergencies.
Yeah, I mean, my problem is and I'm being perfectly honest, I don't know what to believe and who to trust. All I know is that an enormous amount of damage has been done that has not been recognised as damage to the economy, damage to the concepts of our own sense of freedom and our own well-being. And added to that is there are lots of people now calling for, things like a basic universal wage. I hate the idea of everybody becoming employed by the government. I hate the idea of the government having so much power. And I think what we have been through with COVID-19 is a a jacking up of their involvement in our lives.
Yes.
Of course, aided and abetted by the fact that these vast companies control our appetites and control our delivery and all that. They know everything about us. And, you know, you've only got to book a hotel room and you are surrendering so much. I found out this the other day. You are surrendering so much in you know, spending a couple of £100 with somebody. So this is a very, very sticky place. We may need to come back and say, do we need to defenestrate, to throw out of the window a lot of those things? Do we need to get rid of the stuff?
But when governments have more power, they don't tend to give it back, do they?
Well, that's not always true, because the power that the government had to decide whether homosexuality was acceptable, whether same-sex, if you look at those are stripping of the old powers, because what you get is you get people involved.
But
if people get involved in politics,
well, that's it,
if people get involved in
I
demonstrations...
mean, they don't voluntarily give it back.
Oh, no,
we have to...
You have to chivvy them
civil
up. You have to kind of knock them about a bit.
Well, do you think we need a bit of... I don't know about civil unrest, but do we need something...
No, I mean, I think more than anything, we need a really good, well-guided form of participatory democracy. And we have representational democracy, which has demonstrated once again that it fails whenever there's a crisis.
And how do we get there now? How do we get to the place where we get back those powers and take away this sort of...
Well, that means that we've got to start getting involved in just not looking upon life as a cross in a box every 5 years. So we have to try and, I mean, the first thing we need to be doing is get involved in our communities. I think one of the things that came out of COVID, and I saw it because we were working in that area, is we saw people banding together that would never have worked together in the community. If we can carry on and build on that, the problem is that once it's happened, people have retired. You know, the good in an emergency. We need to get that sense.
And we are quite dehumanised now. You can't even go to the bank. They distance. There's the screens in front. It's all... We are a bit depersonalised. But Lord Bird, I know you're off to the Lords right now for a dinner. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I'm really, really proud to have you here, and thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you.
Can I try my Churchillian voice now?
Another poem, or you haven't got time for a poem?
All I was going to say is that what we have to do is learn to stick together, learn to work together, learn in a way that we've never learned before, that actually the only strength we have is solidarity with each other.